Victor Blackthorn's hand came down so fast, Clara barely had time to flinch. The sound of it, palm against cheekbone, cracked through the parlor like a pistol shot, and the two housemaids standing near the door went absolutely still, eyes fixed on the floor, seeing nothing. That was what happened when you worked in Victor Blackthorn's house. You learned very quickly what you were and were not supposed to witness. "You will sign those papers," Victor said. His voice hadn't risen at all. That was the thing about Victor that people who hadn't lived near him could never understand. He was most dangerous when he was calm. "You will sign them, Clara, and this foolishness will be finished by supper." Clara was pressed against the writing desk, one hand braced on the edge of it to keep herself upright. Her ear was ringing. The left side of her face had gone from hot to cold in the space of 3 seconds. She could feel Lily, 8 years old and barely breathing, pressed against her side, one small fist locked around a fistful of her mother's skirt. "She can hear you," Clara said. Victor's eyes moved to Lily the way a man's eyes might move to a piece of furniture he was considering selling. "Good," he said. "Let her understand how this works. If you had ever wondered what it would take to make a woman run across half a country with nothing but a carpetbag and a child's hand, this was the moment. This was it, right here in this parlor, with the afternoon light coming through the curtains and the housemaids staring at nothing. This is the story of Clara Whitfield, a woman who ran, and then learned 1,000 miles away from everything she had known that running and standing your ground are two entirely different acts of courage, and that sometimes you have to learn the first before you're ready for the second. If this story reaches you wherever you are, hit that like button, leave us a comment telling us your city and country, because this story is traveling and we want to know how far it's gone. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to where it all began. The advertisement had been Clara's idea, and she'd written it 3 times before she got it right. She hadn't been trying to sound appealing or interesting or any of the things women's magazines said you were supposed to sound like. She'd been trying to sound honest, which was harder. Widow with 1 child, aged 8, seeks arrangement with rancher or farmer in Western Territory. Capable of hard work. Asks only for a stable home and fair treatment. She hadn't written seeking escape or running from a man who believes he owns her, but those things were in there between the lines for anyone who cared to read carefully. Ethan Callahan had written back within 2 weeks. His letter was shorter than she'd expected, and considerably less romantic than most of the letters she'd heard about from women who'd placed similar advertisements. He didn't describe his ranch in glowing terms or talk about sunsets over the plains. He wrote that he had 300 acres in the Texas Panhandle, a house that needed more work than he had time to give it, 2 horses, a hired hand who came by twice a week, and no family within 400 miles. He wrote that he was not an easy man to know, but that he was a fair one. He wrote that he had no objection to a child, and that any child of hers would be treated with the same respect he'd want shown to himself. Clara read that letter 4 times. Then she folded it, tucked it into the lining of her carpet bag where she kept the things that mattered, and began planning her exit. The exit itself had taken 6 days to arrange and 10 minutes to execute. She'd waited until Victor was in Boston on business. She told no one, not her mother, not her cousin Sarah, not even the older housemaid who had been kind to her, and who would almost certainly be questioned afterward. She'd packed what she could carry. She'd woken Lily at 4 in the morning and dressed her in the dark and said, "We're going on a trip, sweetheart," in the same voice she used for everything so the child wouldn't panic. And Lily, because she was 8 and already understood more than Clara wanted her to, had said, "Are we coming back?" "No," Clara had said. "Good," said Lily. That had broken something open in Clara's chest that she was still, weeks later, trying to understand. The train ride west took 4 days with a change in St. Louis and another in Amarillo, and by the time they transferred to the stagecoach for the last leg into Dust River, both Clara and Lily had eaten through most of the food Clara had packed, exhausted their small supply of books and drawing paper, and reached the particular kind of tired that goes past the body and settles into the bones. Lily slept against Clara's shoulder for the last 3 hours of the journey. Clara did not sleep at all. She watched the landscape change outside the scratched coach window and felt the miles accumulate between herself and everything she'd left behind, and she tried to decide whether what she was feeling was relief or terror or some combination of the two that didn't have a proper name. Victor would come back from Boston to find her gone. He would be furious, not because he loved her. She had understood for a long time now that what he felt for her was nothing like love, but because her leaving was a defeat, and Victor Blackthorne did not absorb defeats gracefully. He would make inquiries. He would send people. Whether he would come himself was the question she couldn't answer, and the one she thought about most in the small hours of the night. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of dry dust, and Clara heard the driver call out Dust River in the flat, uninterested voice of a man who had made this call 500 times. She straightened her hat, adjusted Lily's collar, picked up the carpet bag, and opened the door. The heat hit her first. West Texas in late June was a different species of hot from anything she'd experienced in Connecticut. It was direct and total, as though the sun had made a personal decision about her. The main street of Dust River was exactly as unglamorous as the name suggested. A row of wooden storefronts, a livery stable, a building marked sheriff, a church, and enough dust to fill several small rivers. There were 3 men waiting near the coach. 2 of them were there to collect cargo. The third one was Ethan Callahan. Clara recognized him from no particular feature, but from something in the way he held himself. Slightly apart from the other men, hat in hand, watching the coach door with the particular expression of a man who is trying very hard not to look nervous and not quite succeeding. He was taller than she'd imagined, thinner. His face had been worked over by sun and wind until it looked like something that had been left out in weather and had come through it more or less intact. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a few years over. It was difficult to tell with men who worked outdoors. When Clara stepped down into the dust with Lily pressed close behind her, she saw the exact moment Ethan noticed the child. His eyes went to Lily and then back to Clara, and something moved across his face. Not anger, not the particular cold settling she'd seen on Victor's face when he encountered something unexpected. More like adjustment, like a man recalibrating. Clara's jaw tightened. She pulled Lily a half step behind her without thinking about it, the way she always did. The instinct ground in so deep she no longer noticed she was doing it. "Mrs. Whitfield," Ethan said. He took 2 steps toward her and then stopped, which she noticed. Most men did not stop. Most men kept coming. "I'm Ethan Callahan." "I know," Clara said. "I recognized you." "From what?" He looked genuinely curious rather than flattered. "From the fact that you were trying not to look like you were waiting for someone." He looked at her for a moment, and then something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "Fair enough," he said. He glanced at Lily again, and this time Clara made herself not move, made herself stand still and watch and see what he would do. Ethan crouched down. Not all the way. He didn't get on his knees in the dust, but he lowered himself so he was closer to Lily's eye level, and he looked at her with the same direct, uncomplicated attention he'd given Clara. "I expect the trip was long," he said. Lily, who had not spoken to any adult man other than necessary since the previous winter, said nothing. "I've got a horse named Biscuit," Ethan said. "She's old and she's not good for much anymore, but she lets children pet her without making any kind of fuss about it, in case you're interested." A pause. "What color?" Lily said. "Brown, with 1 white ear." Lily considered this with the gravity of someone weighing a significant decision. "Okay," she finally said. Ethan straightened up. He met Clara's eyes, and something passed between them. Not warmth exactly. Not yet, but something more practical than that. Recognition, maybe. 2 people who had both learned to read situations quickly and who were each doing so now. "The wagon's down the street," he said. "I can carry that bag if you'd like." "I'll carry it myself," Clara said. He nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable thing to say, and turned and walked toward the wagon without another word about it. Clara watched him go for just a moment. Then she took Lily's hand and followed. The drive out to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and it was not a comfortable hour. The road, if you could call it that, was more of a suggestion scratched into the earth by wagon wheels, and the wagon itself had springs that had long since given up any pretense of functioning. Lily fell asleep again almost immediately, her head knocking gently against Clara's shoulder with each rut in the road. Ethan drove without talking, which Clara had expected to find ominous and instead found merely quiet. She was the one who finally broke it. "Your letter said you'd fixed up a room," she said. "Did what I could," Ethan said. "It's not much. The window was broken, so I replaced the glass. The bed was an old one, but I checked the frame and it holds." "For whom?" He glanced at her. "Figured the girl would want her own space." Clara looked at him. "Most men in your situation would have assumed we'd share a room," she said. She wasn't trying to be provocative. She genuinely wanted to understand the landscape she was walking into. Ethan's jaw moved. He looked back at the road ahead. "I figure you've had enough people making assumptions about your situation," he said. "My room is my room. I made up the spare for you. If you want Lily to have the spare, she can have it, and we'll sort something else. There's time to work it out." Clara did not say anything for a moment. "My advertisement said widow," she said. "I know. That's not entirely accurate." Another silence. "I know that too," Ethan said. "Or I figured it. Didn't seem like my business to ask." This was, she would think later, the moment she first understood that the man sitting beside her on that wagon seat was genuinely different from what she'd been afraid he would be. Not because he was perfect or gentle or any of the things women were supposed to hope for, but because he had chosen, very deliberately, not to use what he probably knew against her. She looked out at the flat, endless country spreading away from them in every direction under a sky so large it almost seemed threatening, and she felt something in her chest loosen by a fraction of an inch. Only a fraction. But it was a start. The ranch house was nothing like what she'd grown up in. There was no comparison to be made, and she stopped herself from trying to make one after about 30 seconds. It was a long, low building that looked like it had been added onto several times by people who weren't especially coordinated with each other. So the roof lines didn't quite match, and one end of the porch listed to the right. Inside, it was clean in the way a man's space is clean, swept, functional, without anything extra. The kitchen was large and better equipped than she'd expected. The main room had a stone fireplace and 2 chairs that didn't match. The small room at the back of the house had a new window, an iron bed with a quilt that looked freshly washed, and a small wooden shelf on the wall that held 2 pine cones and a smooth gray river stone arranged with the seriousness of someone who had thought about where to put them. Clara stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment without saying anything. Lily, standing beside her, said, "Is this mine?" "Yes," Ethan said from behind them. Lily walked straight in, sat on the edge of the bed, bounced once to test it, and looked at the shelf with the pine cones. "Did you put those there?" she asked Ethan. "Thought a shelf needed something on it," he said. Lily nodded like this was sensible. She reached out and touched one of the pine cones. Clara turned away from the door because her throat had tightened in a way she hadn't been prepared for, and she didn't want either of them to see it. The first week was the hardest, and not for the reason she'd anticipated. She'd expected to feel trapped. Instead, she felt exposed, which was somehow worse. On the ranch, there was nowhere to be invisible. There was no crowd to move through, no city noise to hide inside of. When she went to the pump in the morning, the only sound was wind and birds and the distant lowing of Ethan's 2 cattle in the south field. When she sat at the kitchen table in the evenings, the silence had weight and texture, and she had to learn to sit inside it without panicking. Ethan was rarely in the house during daylight hours. He was up before dawn and outside working, and Clara learned within the first 3 days that offering to help was the wrong approach, and just starting to help was the right one. She began making breakfast without asking, and he ate it without commenting, and that arrangement seemed to suit them both. She was not a good cook. She had never needed to be back east, where there had been household staff for such things. What she made was competent, and occasionally it was good, and once, in the second week, she burned a pot of beans so thoroughly that the smell of it lingered for 2 days. Ethan, coming in from the field, surveyed the situation and said, "There's hardtack in the top cabinet if we need it." Clara, who had been holding herself rigid with the particular shame of the competent person who has failed at something basic, said, "I'll do better tomorrow." "I know," Ethan said, and got the hardtack, and they ate in silence. and somehow it was less terrible than she'd feared. Lily thrived in ways that frightened Clara a little. The child who had spent the better part of a year barely speaking, barely eating, barely existing in a body that seemed to have decided existence was too risky. That child disappeared somewhere around day 4 on the Callahan Ranch and was replaced by someone Clara almost didn't recognize. Ethan taught her to feed the horses on the 3rd morning, showing her how to hold her hand flat so Biscuit's lips wouldn't catch her fingers. By the end of the 1st week, Lily was doing it on her own, narrating the process to herself in the serious, detailed way she had when something fully occupied her attention. She followed Ethan around the ranch with the focused energy of a small investigator on a case. He didn't send her away or tell her she was in the way. He answered her questions, and there were many questions, about the horses and the cattle and the fencing and the well and what the weather would do and why the sky in the Panhandle looked different from the sky back east. With the same unhurried directness he seemed to apply to everything. One evening, Clara found them sitting on the porch steps in the fading light. Lily, with a stick drawing something in the dust at the bottom of the step. Ethan beside her watching with the particular expression of someone who has nowhere they need to be. "What is that?" Clara asked. "A map of the ranch," Lily said without looking up. "Ethan showed me where the fence goes." Clara looked at Ethan. "She wanted to know the whole property," he said. "Figured it was reasonable." Clara leaned against the porch post and watched her daughter draw fence lines in the Texas dust, and she understood, with a particular complicated feeling, that she was going to have to revise everything she'd been telling herself for 6 weeks about what this arrangement was and what it wasn't. She told him about Victor on a Tuesday night in the 3rd week. She hadn't planned to. She'd been carrying it the way she carried most things, close, private, with the practiced discipline of someone who has learned that sharing information is sharing ammunition. But they'd been sitting at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp between them, and Ethan had been going over the ranch accounts, and she'd been mending one of Lily's dresses, and the combination of the ordinary quiet and 3 weeks of watching this man be exactly who he'd said he was in his letter finally wore through the discipline. She told him without looking up from the mending. She told him about her father's debts and Victor's offer to settle them in exchange for a marriage that was less a marriage than a transfer of property. She told him about what Victor had done when she'd tried to refuse, the first time and the second time and the third. She told him that the bruise she'd been wearing under a high collar when she arrived had been the final one, the one that made her understand there would not be a 4th time because she would be dead or something close to it. She told him that Victor was not a man who let things go. She told him she was afraid he would come. When she finished, the house was very quiet. Ethan set down his pencil. "When he comes," he said, "not if," Clara noted, "we'll handle it." "You don't know Victor." "No," Ethan said, "but I know this land and I know the law in this county and I know Judge Harlan, who doesn't take well to men who come into his territory throwing their money around." He paused. "You did right leaving. I want you to know that. Whatever you're carrying about whether you made the right choice, you did." Clara looked up. He was watching her with that same direct, uncomplicated attention he gave everything. No pity in it. No satisfaction at knowing something difficult about her. Just a man who had been told a hard thing and was responding to it as a hard thing. "You're not angry," she said, "that I didn't say all of this in my advertisement." "You said enough to tell me you were in trouble," Ethan said. "I answered the letter knowing that. Seems like we're even." Clara looked back at the mending in her hands. She had come west looking for a safe harbor. She had expected a transaction. She had not expected, even in her most cautious moments of optimism, this complicated, unromantic, entirely real thing that was already more than she'd bargained for and somehow less frightening than anything she'd known in years. Outside, the wind moved across the plains in the dark. Lily slept in her room with the pine cones on the shelf and the new window glass Ethan had put in before he'd even met her. Clara set down the mending and pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed. One day at a time, she told herself. That had always been enough. She would make it enough again. But somewhere in the back of her mind, where the fear lived and waited with the patience of something that knew it would eventually be answered, she was already counting the days until Victor Blackthorne stepped off a stagecoach in Dust River in his expensive suit with his papers in his hand. And she was wondering, for the first time, whether she would be ready. The counting stopped somewhere around the 5th week. Clara didn't notice it happening. That was the thing about it. There was no morning. She woke up and decided to stop tracking the days since she'd left Connecticut. No deliberate choice to put down the mental arithmetic of how long they'd been gone and how far Victor's reach might extend. It simply stopped, the way a headache sometimes stops. And she only realized it had happened when she was standing at the kitchen window watching Lily chase a grasshopper across the yard, and she understood that she hadn't thought about Victor Blackthorne in almost 3 days. That frightened her more than thinking about him had. She turned back to the bread she was making. She'd gotten better at bread. It was one of the first things to improve, and pressed her knuckles into the dough harder than necessary, as though she could push the complacency back out of herself. Ethan came in at noon the way he always did, dust on his shirt and his hat leaving a red mark across his forehead that took 20 minutes to fade. He washed his hands at the basin and sat down and ate without fanfare. This was the rhythm they had settled into, the two of them, functional, parallel, without the performance of domestic happiness that Clara had watched other married women conduct and had always found exhausting. "The Hendersons are coming Saturday," Ethan said. Clara looked up. "Who are the Hendersons?" "Ranch about 6 miles east, Frank and his wife Ruth. They come by a few times a year." He picked up his coffee. "Ruth will want to look you over." "Look me over." "She's not mean about it," Ethan said. "She just wants to know who her neighbor is. This is a small territory. People pay attention to who moves into it." Clara thought about that. She thought about what it meant to be looked over, evaluated, added to the mental ledger of a community she hadn't chosen and didn't know. Back east, she'd had a social position, a family name, a set of contexts that explained her before she had to explain herself. Out here, she was simply the woman Ethan Callahan had sent for, and she had no idea yet what that meant to anyone. "I'll make something," she said, "for when they come." Ethan nodded and went back to eating, and Clara filed away the name Henderson and began trying to decide what she could make that would survive honest scrutiny. But Ruth Henderson was a large woman in her mid-50s with red hands and a way of looking at you that made you feel she was reading something written on the back of your skull. She brought a jar of preserved peaches and a loaf of actual good bread and set them on Clara's kitchen table with the authority of someone who had been setting things on this table for years, which in a sense she had, since she'd apparently been the one who kept Ethan in occasional baked goods during the years he'd lived out here alone. Frank Henderson was quieter, a big, slow-moving man with a sun-creased face who shook Clara's hand with the careful grip of someone who has been told before that he doesn't know his own strength. He and Ethan drifted outside almost immediately, the way men do, and left Clara and Ruth in the kitchen together. Ruth sat down without being invited, which Clara respected. "He wrote to us," Ruth said, "when he decided to place the advertisement, asked what we thought." "What did you think?" Clara asked. "I thought it was about time." Ruth looked around the kitchen with an appraising eye that softened slightly when it landed on the clean shelves and the pot of coffee on the stove. "He's been out here alone too long. Men get strange when they're alone too long." "Has he gotten strange?" Ruth looked at her directly. "Not Ethan. He's too stubborn to get strange, but he's been closed up, like a house with the shutters down." She paused. "He seems different with you here." Clara didn't know what to do with that, so she poured the coffee. Lily appeared in the doorway then, stopped dead when she saw Ruth, and stared with the frank assessment of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't evaluating. Ruth looked back at her with equal directness. "You must be Lily." "Yes, ma'am." "Can you ride yet?" Lily glanced at Clara. "Ethan's been showing me. I can trot." "Good. Cantering's next." Ruth said it like a prescription. "Come here and let me see you." Lily, who had not let most adults near her for the better part of a year, walked straight over to Ruth Henderson and stood in front of her, which told Clara something she filed away alongside the Henderson name and the jar of preserved peaches. "Good bones," Ruth said to Clara, as though she were discussing a horse, but her voice was kind. After the Hendersons left, Clara sat on the porch in the long evening light and let herself feel something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its texture. Almost comfortable. Not safe. She wasn't ready to use that word, wasn't sure she'd ever use it freely again, but adjacent to it. Something in the neighborhood of safe. The panhandle spread out in front of her in shades of gold and amber as the sun went down, flat and enormous, and completely indifferent to her, and she found that indifference oddly restful after years of living inside Victor's very pointed attention. Ethan came and sat in the other chair without asking, which was what he always did. They'd stopped asking each other permission for the ordinary things. "Ruth likes you," he said. "She likes Lily." "Same thing to Ruth." He stretched his legs out in front of him. "She lost a daughter 11 years ago, fever." He didn't elaborate, and Clara didn't ask him to. "She keeps track of children in this area, notices them." Clara turned that over. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because when Ruth Henderson keeps track of something, that thing is safer than it was before she started." He looked out at the fading light. "I thought you'd want to know." Clara looked at him, the profile of him, the sun-worked jaw and the quiet eyes, and thought about the letter he'd sent her, short and unromantic and exactly accurate. She thought about the pine cones on the shelf. She thought about him saying when he comes rather than if. "You planned all of this," she said. Ethan turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" "The Hendersons, introducing me, having Ruth meet Lily." She paused. "You're building something, around us. She searched for the word. "A position." He was quiet for a moment. "I told you I knew the judge," he said finally. "I told you I knew the land and the law here. What I didn't tell you is that the law out here works different from back east. It's not about papers and offices and men in suits. It's about who people know, who they'll speak for." He looked back at the plains. "Victor Blackthorne comes to Dust River a stranger with papers, and 6 people in this county will tell him to turn around and go home. That's what I'm building." Claire's throat was tight. "You've been thinking about this since I told you," she said. "Since before you told me," he said. "Since your letter." The evening was very quiet around them. "Ethan," Clara said. "I don't—" She stopped, tried again. "I'm not sure yet what this is. Between us. I want to be honest about that." He nodded slowly. "I know. You're not upset." "Why would I be upset?" He sounded genuinely puzzled. "You've been married to the idea of being afraid for so long you've forgotten what it feels like not to be. That's not something I can fix in a month." He paused. "I'm not looking for gratitude, Clara. I'm not looking for you to perform something you don't feel. I just want you and that girl to be able to breathe out here." Clara pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. He was so blunt about it, so completely without artifice. She kept waiting for the calculation to show itself, for the seam to appear where the performance joined the reality, and it never did, and that in itself was something she didn't entirely know how to handle. "Thank you," she said, "for what that's worth." "It's worth something," Ethan said, and let it rest there. The second month brought 3 things: a summer storm that took half the barn roof, a dispute with a neighboring rancher over fence lines that lasted 2 weeks and resolved itself without violence, and Clara's discovery that she was considerably more capable than she'd been led to believe. The roof was her first real test. The storm came on a Thursday night with almost no warning. A wall of black sky moving in from the northwest, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in an hour, and then the wind arriving like something physical and furious that hit the barn broadside and peeled 40 feet of roofing back like a page being turned. Ethan was already outside when Clara pulled on her boots, and when she came out into the chaos of rain and wind, he turned and shouted something she couldn't hear. She pointed at the barn. He shook his head and pointed toward the house. Clara pointed at the barn again, with more emphasis. There was a pause in which they looked at each other through the rain, and then Ethan turned back to the barn, and she followed him, and they spent the next 2 hours in the dark and the wet doing the ugly, exhausting work of securing what could be secured and letting go of what couldn't. She was not graceful at it. She pulled a muscle in her left shoulder that would bother her for a week. She cut her palm on a piece of loose tin, and at one point she fell in the mud and came up swearing in a way that would have horrified her mother. But the horses were settled and the feed stayed dry, and when they finally came inside at past midnight, soaked and filthy, Ethan looked at her across the kitchen as she was wrapping her hand in a strip of cloth and said simply, "Good." That one word sat in her chest for days afterward. But the fence dispute was more complicated because it involved a man named Garrett Poole, who ran a cattle operation 2 miles to the south and who had apparently been quietly moving survey stakes for the better part of a year in the direction of Ethan's southern pasture. Ethan discovered this on a Monday morning, came home at noon with his jaw set in the particular way Claire had learned meant he was holding something back, and told her what he'd found. "What will you do?" she asked. "Go talk to him." "Will that work?" "No," Ethan said, "but it's the first step." Clara thought about it while he was gone. She thought about property documents and what it would take to prove a boundary, and what Ethan had said about the way law worked in this territory. Through people, through relationships, through who would speak for you. When he came back 2 hours later looking exactly as unsatisfied as she'd expected, she said, "Do you have the original survey documents?" He looked at her. "For the property. The original survey. Do you have it?" "Somewhere. In the desk." "Then that's where we start." She was already moving toward the desk. Back east, Victor's lawyers used to say that half of all property disputes are settled by whoever can find their paperwork first. The other half are settled by whoever has more money. You have the paperwork. Let's find it. Ethan stood in the doorway watching her open the desk drawer and begin sorting through the accumulated chaos of years of ranch records. "You know about property law?" "I know about watching powerful men use it." She found a folded document and held it up to the light. "Is this it?" He came over and looked. "That's it." "Good." She smoothed it open on the table. "Now, show me where Poole moved the stakes." The dispute was resolved by the end of the following week, when Ethan arrived at Garrett Poole's property with Judge Harlan's clerk and the original survey document, and a very specific accounting of exactly how far the stakes had moved and over how long a period. Poole, confronted with documentation rather than anger, folded like wet paper. Ethan came home and found Clara in the yard teaching Lily how to braid a piece of rope, and he sat on the fence and said, "You were right." "About which part?" "Paperwork." Clara looked up. "My father used to say that the men who understand that are the dangerous ones." "Your father sounds like he had some sense." "He did," Clara said. "He just ran out of it at the end." She went back to the rope. Ethan watched her for a moment. "Where did you learn to think like that?" "Necessity," Clara said. "It's a very good teacher." Dot. Lily was changing in ways that Clara tracked with the particular attention of someone who has watched a child very closely for signs of distress, and is now learning, with some confusion, to track signs of the opposite. The girl ate. This was the first thing. She ate full meals now, ate without the anxious looking around she'd been doing since the previous winter, ate like a child who had decided the food would still be there tomorrow. She slept through the night. She woke up noisy and immediate, the way children are supposed to wake up, talking before she'd fully opened her eyes. She talked to Ethan about everything. This was the part Clara watched most carefully, with the most complicated feelings. Lily had not talked to adult men voluntarily in a long time, and here she was following Ethan from the barn to the well to the south fence line, asking him about cattle grazing patterns, and whether coyotes were afraid of fire, and what the biggest storm he'd ever seen in the Panhandle had done to the land after. Ethan answered every question, not with the patient, slightly martyred air of an adult tolerating a child, but with the direct engagement of someone who considered the questions worth answering. When he didn't know something, he said so, which Lily found fascinating. She had been surrounded, for the first years of her life, by adults who always had answers. One afternoon, Clara overheard them from inside the house, the window open to the mild September air. "Why don't you have children?" Lily was asking. A pause. "Never had the right circumstances," Ethan said. "What does that mean?" "Means life went a different direction." "Do you want them?" Another pause, longer. "I think I just got some," Ethan said. Clara stood very still at the kitchen window. She heard Lily think about that, heard the silence of a child processing something. "You mean me and Mama?" "I mean you and your mother, yes." "We're not really yours, though." "No," Ethan said, "not technically, But most things worth having aren't technically yours. You just take care of them and try to deserve them. Clara turned away from the window and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Then she straightened up and went back to the bread. She found him in the barn one evening in the blue hour before full dark, sitting on an upturned crate with a piece of bridle leather in his hands that he appeared to have been mending for some time without making much progress. She'd come out to tell him supper was on the table and had stopped in the doorway instead because there was something about the way he was sitting, the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man alone with something he was working through, that made her hesitate. "Ethan." He looked up. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." "Something's wrong," she said, and came the rest of the way into the barn. She sat on a hay bale across from him and waited, because she had learned that waiting worked better with him than asking. It took a few minutes. "Got a letter today?" he said finally. "From my brother in Lubbock." He turned the bridle leather over in his hands. "He says there's been a man asking questions. In Amarillo first, and then heading south. Expensive clothes, Connecticut accent." The air in the barn changed. Clara had known this moment was coming. She had known it the way you know a winter storm is coming. Not because you can see it yet, but because the animal part of you that evolved to survive has been monitoring the pressure in the air and quietly preparing. And still her hands went cold. "How long ago?" she said. Her voice came out level, which surprised her. "Letters dated 8 days. Ethan set the bridle leather down. "He could be in Amarillo now, could be closer." "He's not coming to negotiate," Clara said. "I know." "He doesn't negotiate. He arrives and he presents a situation as though it's already settled. And most people—" She stopped. "Most people don't understand that you can say no to Victor Blackthorne. They see the suit and the money, and they assume the outcome is already determined." Ethan was watching her. "What does he want most?" he asked. "If you had to say, the property or you?" Clara thought about that. She'd thought about it before. In the dark hours back in Connecticut, when she'd been mapping out her own captivity and trying to understand its architecture. "He wants to win," she said. "The property is part of it, but really he can't stand having been refused. A woman telling him no it's a wound to something in him that doesn't heal normally." She pressed her hands together in her lap. "I think he'd give up the property if he could just make me come back, just to prove he could." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And Lily?" Clara's jaw tightened. "Lily is leverage. He knows she's the only thing that could actually break me." The word broke in her mouth because it was the right word and she hated it. Ethan stood up from the crate. He wasn't a man who paced. He stood very still, or he moved with purpose, and there was nothing in between. And he stood still now, looking at her. "I want to do something," he said, "and I want to ask you before I do it." Clara looked at him. "I want to go see Judge Harlan tomorrow morning. I want to explain your situation and ask what our options are, legally." He paused. "But I won't do it without your agreement. This is your life. These are your choices. I don't get to make them for you." Clara looked at him for a long time. She had been in situations, many of them, where a man had told her a version of "I'm going to help you" and had meant "I'm going to take this over." She had learned to read the difference, or she thought she had, but she had also learned that she was not infallible at it, that the need to believe people was sometimes stronger than the evidence. She looked at Ethan Callahan in the blue-gray light of the barn and tried to find the seam, the calculation, the place where the offer curdled into something else. She couldn't find it. "All right," she said. "Go see the judge." He nodded. That was all. Just a nod, and then he picked up the bridle leather again and said, "Supper ready?" "It's been ready for 10 minutes. "Sorry," he said, and didn't sound particularly sorry, and they walked back to the house together in the last of the evening light. She told Lily that night. Not everything. Not Victor's name, not the details of the last year, not the things a child shouldn't have to carry. But she sat on the edge of Lily's bed in the small room with the pine cones on the shelf, and she said, "There may be someone coming soon, someone from back home." Lily was quiet. "Someone who wants us to go back?" she said finally. "Yes." "Are we going to?" "No," Clara said. Lily was quiet again, thinking with the slow thoroughness she'd always had, even as a very small child. Is Ethan going to help? Yes? Good, Lily said. She pulled her quilt up and turned on her side. He's not afraid of hard things. Clara sat on the edge of the bed for another minute after Lily's breathing evened out. Not afraid of hard things. She reached out and touched one of the pine cones on the shelf, lightly, with 2 fingers. Then she got up and went to bed, and lay awake for a long time listening to the wind coming in from the northwest, the same direction the winter storms came from, carrying the smell of distance and cold earth, and a future she still couldn't see the shape of. But she was still here. She had not run. And when morning came, she got up and made breakfast and stood at the window watching Ethan saddle his horse in the early light. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in the dust with a carpet bag and a frightened child and a hidden bruise and no certainty about anything at all. And she thought that woman was still there, still frightened, still uncertain, but she was standing in a kitchen she had learned to work in a territory she was beginning to understand, beside a man who asked her permission before acting on her behalf. That was not nothing. That, she was beginning to think, was the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that wasn't safety exactly, but was the ground on which safety might eventually be built. Ethan rode out toward town in the early morning light, and Clara watched until he was a small shape against the flat horizon, and then she turned back to the kitchen and began the day. Judge Harlan was a small man, which surprised people who hadn't met him before, because his reputation in the Panhandle had the dimensions of someone considerably larger. He was perhaps 60, with white hair cut close, and a face that had folded itself over the years into an expression of permanent, skeptical attention. He ran his court out of a building that had previously been a dry goods store, and still smelled faintly of flour and axle grease, and he had a habit of listening to people with his eyes half closed that made nervous men talk too much and say things they hadn't intended to say. Ethan came back from town at midday and found Clara at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts open in front of her. She'd taken over the bookkeeping in the 6th week because Ethan's system, such as it was, involved writing numbers on whatever paper was nearest and hoping to reconcile them later, which was not a system at all. "What did he say?" she asked, without looking up. Ethan sat down across from her and put his hat on the table. "He says the papers Victor's carrying are probably a betrothal contract, legal in Connecticut. Not worth much out here." Clara looked up. "He says if you're married to someone in Texas, a betrothal contract from back east is a document and nothing more. He can't compel you to return. He can't take Lily. She's your daughter, not his, and there's no court in this territory that would award custody to a man with no biological or legal claim." Ethan paused. He did say Victor could try to argue the case in a federal court, but that would take months and cost more than most men would spend. "Victor would spend it," Clara said. "Maybe." Ethan's jaw shifted. Harlan also said there's a faster way to close the door entirely. She already knew what he was going to say. She'd known since the night before in the barn when she'd watched him pick up that bridle leather, when she'd registered in some back part of her mind that the conversation they were circling would eventually arrive at this. "Marriage," she said, "a legal marriage recorded in this county, changes your status. Changes Lily's status." He met her eyes steadily. "I want to be clear that I'm telling you this as information, not as a request." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what marriage had meant in her life up to this point. Her parents' marriage, which had been a financial arrangement dressed in sentiment. The marriage Victor had tried to impose on her, which had been ownership with paperwork attached. She thought about what marriage would mean now, in practical terms, in a territory where law ran through people and relationships rather than offices and courts. She thought about Lily. "How long do we have?" she said. "Before he gets here." "Harlan thinks 3-4 days at most if he's already in Amarillo." Ethan folded his hands on the table. "Could be sooner." Clara looked back down at the accounts. "Let me think," she said. He got up, took his hat, and went back outside. That was another thing about him she had cataloged without meaning to. He didn't push. He stated a thing and then gave her room, which was so different from her experience of men that she still sometimes waited for it to stop, for the moment when the patience ran out and the pressure came back. It hadn't come yet. She sat at the table for a long time with the accounts open but unread in front of her, listening to the wind outside and the distant sound of Lily talking to Biscuit in the paddock. And she made her decision with the same practical deliberateness she'd used to plan her exit from Connecticut. Not from hope, not from feeling, but from a clear-eyed accounting of what the situation required. Come. She went out to the paddock at mid-afternoon and stood at the fence while Lily ran a brush along Biscuit's flank with the grave attention she gave all things she'd decided to do properly. "Lily," Clara said, "come here a minute." Lily came, still holding the brush. She looked at her mother's face, and her own went careful the way it did when she was preparing for something hard. "I need to ask you something," Clara said, "and I need you to tell me honestly what you think. Not what you think I want to hear." Lily nodded. "How would you feel," Clara said, "if Ethan became more permanent, part of the family, officially?" Lily looked at her. Then she looked out at the south field where Ethan was working on a section of fencing, a small figure in the distance. "Like a father?" Lily said. "Like a stepfather, legally." Clara kept her voice neutral. "It would change some things, technically, for both of us." Lily was quiet for a long moment. "I already call him Ethan," she said, "not Mr. Callahan." "I know. He fixed my window before he even met me." "I know that too." Lily turned the brush over in her hands, thinking. "Does he want to?" "He offered," Clara said. Another silence. "Then yes," Lily said, with the simple finality of a child who has thought a thing through to its conclusion and found no objection. She turned back to Biscuit. "Can I keep brushing?" "Yes," Clara said. "You can keep brushing." She walked back to the house, and she found Ethan coming in from the south field at almost the same moment, and he read something in her face before she said a word. "All right," Clara said. "Let's go see the judge." They were married on a Thursday morning with Frank and Ruth Henderson as witnesses, and Lily standing beside Clara in her best dress, which had a tear in the left sleeve that Clara had mended twice, and which kept coming undone at the same place. So by the time Judge Harlan finished the brief legal proceedings, there was a small white thread hanging from Lily's elbow that she kept trying to tuck back in and couldn't. It was not romantic. The room smelled of flour and old wood, and the judge had a cold that made him sniff periodically throughout the reading of the words. Ethan said what he was supposed to say in the flat, direct way he said everything. Clara said what she was supposed to say and meant most of it, and was honest enough with herself to admit that the parts she didn't fully mean yet were the parts that were about feeling, not intention, and feeling was something you couldn't manufacture on a timeline. Afterward, Ruth Henderson produced a small cake from a basket she'd apparently been carrying the whole time without anyone noticing, which was so thoroughly Ruth that even Clara laughed. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon light, the four of them, Ethan and Clara on the wagon seat, Lily and the remaining cake in the back, and Clara Whitfield, who was now legally Clara Callahan, watched the flat land go past and felt the strangeness of having done something irreversible, and found it, to her own surprise, less frightening than she'd expected. "You're quiet," Ethan said. I'm usually quiet." "Quieter than usual." She looked at him. "I was thinking that I've done 2 large, irreversible things in 4 months. Left everything I knew and then attached myself legally to a stranger." "Am I still a stranger?" he asked. She considered that. "Less than you were," she said. "More than you'll be." He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. They rode the rest of the way home without talking, which was, Clara thought, its own kind of answer to the question of whether he was a stranger. Victor Blackthorne arrived in Dust River on a Saturday. Clara knew before anyone told her. She'd been on edge for 2 days in the way of someone waiting for a sound they've been dreading, and when she saw the expression on Frank Henderson's face when he rode up to the house that morning, she set down what she was holding and said, "He's here." Frank didn't insult her by pretending otherwise. "Rode in last night, staying at the hotel." He glanced at Ethan, who had come out from the barn. "He's been talking to people this morning." "What's he saying?" Ethan asked. "Says Clara stole something of his." Frank's voice was neutral, informational. "Says she's unstable, and she took his daughter." The air went out of Clara's lungs for just a moment. His daughter. He was saying Lily was his daughter. She turned away from both men and walked to the fence and gripped the top rail and breathed, one breath and then another, until the white anger behind her eyes settled back to something she could think through. She heard Ethan behind her say something quiet to Frank that she couldn't make out, and she heard Frank ride away, and then Ethan was standing beside her at the fence without touching her. "He's claiming Lily," she said. Her voice came out flat. "I heard." "She's not his. She has never been his. Her father was—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. Her father left before she was born. Victor knew that. He told me once that her having no father made things simpler, that he would formalize it later, when it suited him. The fury in that memory was old and cold and very sharp. He never did, because he never intended to. She was always just something he could use. "Does she have a birth record?" Ethan asked. Clara turned to look at him. "I kept everything," she said. "Her birth record, the document from her father relinquishing all claim, everything. I told you I didn't come unprepared. It's all in the carpet bag." Ethan's expression shifted by about a degree. "Get it," he said. "We're going to see Harlan." Chad. Judge Harlan received them in his office with the equanimity of a man who had been expecting this visit and had used the intervening time productively. There was already a document on his desk when they arrived, and he looked up from it with his half-closed eyes and said, "I've been informed your situation has arrived in town." "He's claiming the child," Ethan said. "I've heard what he's claiming." Harlan looked at Clara. "Mrs. Callahan, what documentation do you have?" Clara laid the documents on his desk one by one. The birth record, the relinquishment. 3 letters from Victor himself, written during the period of his courtship, that referenced Lily as your daughter without any qualification. 2 letters from her father's attorney confirming the terms of the relinquishment. Harlan looked through them without hurrying. "The marriage record is already filed," he said, more to himself than to them. "Since Thursday," Ethan said. Harlan set the documents down and folded his hands on top of them. "Mr. Blackthorne came to see me yesterday evening," he said. Neither Clara nor Ethan said anything. He presented papers he described as a betrothal contract with legal force. Harlan's voice was completely without inflection. "I told him that a betrothal contract from Connecticut has no authority in this court, that the woman in question is legally married to a resident of this county, and that any claim to a child requires biological or legal establishment of paternity, of which he appears to have neither." A pause. "He didn't care for that." "I imagine not," Clara said. "He suggested that my understanding of federal law was limited." Harlan's eyes moved to Clara with something that might have been dry amusement. "I suggested he consult a local attorney before making further suggestions of that nature." "Will he pursue it?" Ethan asked. "He'll try something," Harlan said. "Men like that don't absorb the word no quietly." He looked at both of them. "I want you to be prepared for the possibility that he'll work sideways. Talk to your neighbors. Try to build a case out of reputation and insinuation rather than law, since the law isn't going to give him what he wants." He paused. "Is there anything in Mrs. Callahan's history that he could use to argue instability or unfitness?" Clara met his eyes directly. "There are bruises that have healed," she said, "that are his work, if that counts as instability." Harlan held her gaze. "No," he said, "it does not." He stood up, which in a small man signified the same thing that a larger man might signal by straightening to his full height. "Go home. Stay on your property. If he comes to you directly, send for me." What? He didn't come directly. That would not have been Victor's way. What he did instead was spend 3 days moving through Dust River with his eastern suit and his careful voice and his story, and the story changed slightly each time he told it depending on his audience, the way stories do when they're constructed rather than true. To the men at the saloon, it was a tale of a man wronged by a scheming woman. To the women at the dry goods store, it was the tragedy of a devoted father searching for his child. To the minister, it was a moral failing that needed to be corrected. Clara knew all of this because Ruth Henderson knew all of it within hours of its occurrence, and Ruth Henderson had no patience for men who operated by innuendo. "He came into May Patterson's store this morning," Ruth told Clara on the second day, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between her hands. "Said you were mentally delicate. Said you'd had episodes. Said the child was in danger." Clara's hands were still on the tabletop. What did May Patterson say? Ethan asked from near the window. May Patterson said she'd met Clara Callahan and she seemed considerably more clear-headed than most people she knew. Ruth looked at Clara. May's not easily impressed. You should know that. I don't know May well, Clara said. You helped her carry flour sacks to her wagon in August when her boy was sick. She remembers it. Clara thought back. She barely remembered it herself. It had seemed like an ordinary thing to do. He's building something, Ethan said. He's building it out of small pieces. Rumors, impressions. Let him build, Ruth said. This town has known Ethan Callahan for 11 years. They don't know Victor Blackthorne from a stone in the road. Reputation can be dismantled, Clara said quietly. Ruth looked at her. So can a man's confidence, she said. When enough people have looked him in the eye and told him they're not interested in his story. Victor came to the ranch on the third day. Clara saw him from the window first. The figure coming up the road in the afternoon heat, too well dressed for the dust, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who is performing certainty. Her stomach dropped in the old way, the animal way that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with the 2 years she'd spent learning that his footsteps meant trouble. But she didn't move back from the window. She stood and watched him come. Ethan had seen him too from the yard, and he didn't go inside or reach for anything. He stood and waited. The way he stood and waited for weather, with the patience of someone who has decided to meet a thing rather than avoid it. Victor stopped at the gate. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Some mark of the months between, some sign that his failure to find her immediately had cost him something. But he looked almost exactly as he always had, composed, expensive, wearing his confidence the way he wore his suit, as though both had been tailored to make him look larger than he was. Clara, he said, as though they were meeting at a social gathering. Mr. Blackthorne. She had come out onto the porch. She'd done it without deciding to, moved through the door and down the 2 steps, and come to stand beside Ethan in the yard. Victor's eyes moved to Ethan and then back to her with the particular assessment of a man doing arithmetic. He registered the ring on her hand. Something tightened around his eyes. I'd like to speak with you, he said, privately. No, Clara said. A small silence. Victor was not accustomed to the word delivered that cleanly, without apology or softening. She could see him processing it. I've come a long way, he said. I know, Clara said. That was your choice. He looked at Ethan. I don't believe we've been introduced. Ethan Callahan, Ethan said. Her husband. Another small silence, this one with more weight in it. I see you've been busy, Victor said to Clara. The tone was smooth, almost amused, but she knew that tone. It was the tone he used when he was measuring a situation and deciding which lever to apply. I should tell you that a marriage contracted under these circumstances may not hold the legal weight you're hoping for. Judge Harlan disagrees with you, Ethan said, and it's his county. Courts can be appealed. Victor turned his eyes back to Clara. I'm not here to fight, Clara. I'm here to talk sense. Whatever this man has offered you, he offered me a fair home and honest treatment, Clara said. You should write those words down. They'll be new to you. Something moved across Victor's face. Just briefly. A crack in the composed surface, the flash of something beneath it that was uglier than what he showed in public. She'd seen that expression before. She'd seen it right before the last time his hand had come down on her face. But there was a fence between them, and Ethan beside her, and 2 months of panhandle ground under her feet. Where's the child? Victor said. Not here, Clara said. She had sent Lily to the Hendersons that morning because she was not going to have this conversation with Lily anywhere near it. And she won't be available for you to see. She's not yours, Clara said. The words came out with more force than she'd planned, from somewhere below the careful control she'd been maintaining, from the place where the old fury lived. She has never been yours. You have no biological claim, no legal claim, and no moral claim to that child. I have documents that establish all of this, which Judge Harlan has already reviewed. Victor was very still. You've thought this through, he said. I had time, Clara said. On the train. He looked at her for a long moment. She made herself hold his gaze, which was harder than it should have been. The old training, the old reflexive dropping of the eyes, the learned behavior of 2 years was still in her body, even when her mind had moved past it. She held the gaze. "You've changed," Victor said. His voice had dropped slightly. "Yes," Clara said. "I'm not leaving Texas," he said. "I want you to understand that. Whatever papers you've filed, whatever this arrangement is, I have resources you don't have and time you don't have, and I will find the right angle." "You might," Ethan said. His voice was entirely calm. "But while you're looking for it, I want you to be aware of something. This county has an elected sheriff, a sitting judge, and about 200 families who've lived near each other long enough to know each other's business. You've been in this town 3 days, and you've already made 4 of those families decide they don't care for you." He paused. "You can have resources. We have neighbors. Out here, that second thing is usually more useful." Victor looked at him with the flat assessment of a man who is accustomed to dismissing people and has found himself unable to find the right basis for dismissal. "This isn't finished," he said to Clara. "Yes, it is," she said. "You just don't know it yet." He held her gaze for another few seconds. Then he turned and walked back down the road the way he'd come, his expensive shoes raising small puffs of dust with each step, and Clara watched him go and kept her breathing even and did not allow herself to shake until he was completely out of sight. Then she sat down on the porch step because her legs had decided they were done. Ethan sat beside her. He didn't say anything for a minute. "You didn't flinch," he said. "I was flinching on the inside." He couldn't see the inside. Clara pressed her palms against her knees. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she was not going to apologize for it. "He's not done," she said. "He meant that." "I know he meant it." Ethan's voice was level. "But there's something he doesn't understand about this place. He thinks law is what's written down somewhere. Out here, it's what people agree to enforce." He looked down the now empty road. "He's not going to find enough people who'll agree to enforce his version." Clara leaned her elbows on her knees and pressed her face into her hands for just a moment. Not crying. She was past the point where Victor made her cry. Had been past it for a long time. Just breathing into the darkness of her own palms and letting the adrenaline work its way out of her. "I need to get Lily," she said finally. "I'll ride to Henderson's," Ethan said. "I want to go." "Then we'll both go." She lifted her face from her hands. The late afternoon sky over the panhandle was enormous and cloudless, the kind of sky that seemed to have been designed to make human problems feel small, and she stared at it for a moment with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been braced for impact and is now trying to recalibrate. "I said, yes, it is," she said quietly. "I told him it was finished. I heard. I don't know if I believe it." "You don't have to believe it yet," Ethan said. "You just had to say it. That was enough for today." Victor's next move came not through the courts, but through a man named Dale Cruz, who was a lawyer of the ambulatory variety, the kind who moved from territory to territory, attaching himself to whoever could pay his fee, with no particular interest in justice and a highly developed interest in winning. He arrived in Dust River 2 days after Victor's visit to the ranch and immediately went to see Judge Harlan, which told Clara, when Ruth reported it, that Victor had done at least some research and understood that Harlan was the obstacle. What happened in that meeting she learned from Harlan himself, who sent a message asking Ethan to come to his office. They both went. Harlan was behind his desk with the expression of a man who has been presented with something unpleasant and has been sitting with it long enough to decide what to do about it. He waited until they were both seated. "Cruz has filed a motion," he said. "It's arguing that the marriage is fraudulent, that it was contracted specifically to circumvent a prior legal obligation." Clara absorbed this. "Can he do that?" "He can file anything he wants," Harlan said. "Filing a motion and having it succeed are different things." He looked at Clara steadily. "But I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this goes to a formal hearing. If it does, you'll need to testify." "About what?" Ethan asked. "About the nature of the marriage, about the circumstances." Harlan paused. "Cruz will argue that there was no genuine marriage, that it was a legal maneuver. He'll try to establish that you and Mr. Callahan had no real relationship prior to the ceremony." The room was quiet. Clara looked at Ethan. He was looking at the judge with the same steady attention he gave everything. "What do we need to show?" Clara asked. "That the marriage is real," Harlan said simply. "That it isn't a document. That there's—" He made a small gesture that was as close as a man like Harlan got to something imprecise, substance to it. Clara thought about the kitchen table and the ranch accounts. She thought about the barn roof in the storm and the mud she'd fallen in and the muscle she'd pulled in her shoulder. She thought about burned beans and the fence dispute and good said in the gray early morning after 2 hours of wet work. She thought about a small wooden shelf with 2 pine cones and a gray river stone arranged by a man who thought shelves needed something on them. "It's real," she said. Harlan looked at her. Something in his face settled slightly. "Good," he said. "Then tell me everything, and we'll make sure it's on record." What? The hearing was set for 10 days out. Those 10 days had a different texture from everything that had come before, a tightness in the air, a quality of waiting that was exhausting in a way that ordinary work was not. Clara found herself making small errors she didn't usually make, missing figures in the accounts, adding salt twice to things, standing in the middle of rooms having forgotten why she'd walked into them. She slept badly and woke early and went through the days with the careful, deliberate attention of someone operating on reduced resources. Ethan was aware of it. He didn't comment on the small errors or suggest she rest, which would have annoyed her, but he redistributed small tasks without announcing he'd done it, so that her mornings were slightly lighter than they'd been, and he started making coffee himself so it was ready when she came downstairs. She noticed all of it. She said nothing about it. She thought he probably knew she'd noticed, and they left it at that. Lily, meanwhile, had been told something closer to the full truth, because she was old enough that attempting to protect her from it entirely would only make it more frightening. Clara told her that a man from back east was trying to make a legal argument that he had rights he didn't have, and that they were going to court to show the judge that he was wrong. "Is Ethan coming?" Lily asked. "Yes." "Then it'll be fine," Lily said. Clara wanted to share her daughter's certainty and couldn't, but she found it useful anyway. On the 7th day, Frank Henderson came by with 2 other ranchers Clara had met in passing, a man named Holt, who ran cattle to the east, and a woman named Dorothea Pierce, who owned a small horse operation and had the bearing of someone who had never once in her life said something she didn't mean. They sat around the kitchen table and drank coffee and told Clara and Ethan that they intended to appear at the hearing as character witnesses. "You don't have to do that," Clara said. Dorothea Pierce looked at her with mild exasperation. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm doing it because a man from Connecticut has spent a week telling people in my town that you're unfit, and I find that offensive." She set down her coffee cup. "I've watched you work. I've watched how you handle your daughter. I've watched how you handle your husband. You're not unfit. You're just—" She searched for the word. "Still finding your feet." Clara sat with that for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Dorothea said. "Just be prepared to answer their questions cleanly. Judges don't like people who perform. They like people who say the plain thing." Well, on the 9th night, Clara couldn't sleep at all. She got up at 2 in the morning and went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark without lighting a lamp. And she sat with everything she was carrying, the fear that the hearing would go wrong, the older fear that even if it went right, Victor would find another angle, the fear she almost never let herself look at directly, which was the fear that she had already used up whatever luck she had in getting this far and that the world was about to correct the imbalance. She heard Ethan's door. His footsteps in the hall were quiet, but she'd learned the sound of them. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her sitting there in the dark, and he didn't ask what was wrong or tell her to go back to sleep. He lit the lamp at the low setting that gave just enough light to see by and sat down across from her. They were quiet for a while. "Tell me something about this territory," Clara said finally. "Something that isn't about Victor or courts or any of this." Ethan looked at her. Then he thought for a moment. 3 years ago, he said, there was a winter storm that came in November and lasted 9 days. Cold that froze the water in the pipes and killed 2 of my cattle and kept everything living within walls for the better part of a week." He looked at the table. "On the 7th day, I was pretty sure I'd made a mistake coming out here. Started thinking about going back to wherever a person goes when they admit they've misjudged something. What changed your mind?" 8th day, the storm broke. Went outside and the land was just—" He paused. "Clear, all the way to the horizon. The kind of clear you don't get in places with more people in them. I stood out there for about 20 minutes, not doing anything, and by the end of it, I knew I wasn't going anywhere. Clara looked at him. The hard thing was the price of the clear thing, she said. That's usually how it works, Ethan said. She was quiet for a moment. I'm afraid, she said, in case that wasn't obvious. It's obvious, he said. It would be strange if you weren't. I'm afraid that even with Harlan and the documents and the neighbors, it won't be enough. That Victor will find something, some angle, the way he always finds angles. And I'll have to take Lily and run again, and this time there won't be anywhere far enough. Ethan was quiet for a moment. There's something I should have said to you earlier, he said, before now. He looked at her across the lamp. I have not been a man with a lot of people in my life. By choice, mostly, because it's easier. But what I have out here, the land, the neighbors, the history with Harlan, the years of showing up and doing the work, that's not nothing. Victor Blackthorne has money. That's real. But money is a thing you spend, and when it's gone, it's gone. He folded his hands on the table. What I have doesn't get spent. Clara looked at him for a long time. She thought that she had come west to find a practical arrangement and a safe harbor. She thought about the distance between what she'd expected and where she was sitting now, in a kitchen at 2 a.m, across a table from a man who had just told her in the plainest possible terms that he intended to hold. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that was adequate. She reached out and put her hand over his folded hands on the table. Not romantically, just the gesture of one person reaching toward another across a difficult night. He didn't move his hands or make anything of it. He just let her hand be there. They sat like that until the lamp needed tending, and then Clara went back to bed and slept, finally, for 4 solid hours before the morning came and brought with it the last day before the hearing and all the weight of what would happen next. The morning of the hearing, Clara burned the toast. She stood at the stove and watched it happen and did nothing about it, which was how she knew her mind was somewhere else entirely. The smell of char brought her back, and she pulled the pan off the heat and looked at the 2 blackened pieces and felt a completely disproportionate wave of frustration rise up in her chest before she pushed it back down. Ethan came in from outside, read the situation, and said nothing about the toast. He poured himself coffee and sat down and waited while she made more. And the silence between them was the functional kind, not the heavy kind, which she was grateful for. Lily ate her breakfast with the focused efficiency of a child who understood that today was not an ordinary day and had decided the best thing she could do was not add to the weight of it. She'd asked the night before if she was coming to the hearing, and Clara had said no, that she was going to the Hendersons, and Lily had nodded and gone to bed without arguing, which was its own kind of measure of how much she'd grown in 4 months. Ruth will pick her up at 8, Ethan said. I know. Clara sat down across from him with her coffee. I've been over everything Harlan told us, everything I need to say. I know you have. I'm going over it again. I know that too. He looked at her. Clara. She looked up. You've been telling the truth since you walked off that stagecoach, he said. Cruz is going to try to make the truth sound like something else. That's what he does. But truth is harder to dismantle than a lie because there are more pieces of it. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Victor is very good at dismantling things. He's never been in Harlan's court, Ethan said. That was all he said about it, and it was enough. And Clara ate the second batch of toast, and they drove to town in the early morning before the heat had fully arrived. And she watched the flat land move past and thought about pine cones on a shelf, and a man who asked permission before acting on her behalf, and she held those things carefully in her mind like a lantern held against the wind. The former dry goods store had never been so full. Clara had not expected the gallery, the rows of chairs behind the low dividing rail that in a real courthouse would have been a proper bar, but here was simply a length of pine that Frank Henderson had apparently built and donated some years back. She had not expected those chairs to be occupied, but they were, by a cross-section of Dust River and its surroundings that she recognized in pieces. May Patterson from the dry goods store, a half-dozen ranching families she'd met at various points over the past 3 months, the sheriff, the minister, 3 men she didn't know at all who turned out to be ranchers from the North County who'd heard about the situation through the web of communication that seemed to operate in this territory with the speed and efficiency of telegraph wire. Ruth Henderson was in the third row with her red hands folded in her lap and her expression set to the particular frequency she used when she had decided something and was waiting for the world to catch up. She caught Claire's eye when they came in and gave one small nod that somehow communicated everything it needed to. Victor was already there. He was seated on the far side of the room with Dale Cruz beside him, and Cruz was a type Clara recognized immediately, the kind of lawyer who used volume and confidence as substitutes for substance, who leaned across tables and pointed fingers and filled rooms with the impression of authority. He was perhaps 50, with a thick mustache and a suit that was almost as expensive as Victor's. He was talking rapidly into Victor's ear when they came in and stopped when he saw them. Victor looked at Clara across the room. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds and then looked away. Not because she had to, but because she'd made her point and there was nothing else she needed from that exchange. Harlan came in from the back at 8:10, moving with the deliberate pace of a small man who has never in his life felt the need to hurry on anyone else's account. He sat down, settled his papers, looked at both sides of the room with his half-closed eyes, and said, "This court is in session. Let's get through this without wasting each other's time." What? Cruz opened with this argument Clara had expected and prepared for, that the marriage between Clara Whitfield and Ethan Callahan was a legal fabrication, contracted specifically to circumvent the obligations contained in a prior agreement, and that as such, it should be set aside as fraudulent, restoring Mr. Blackthorne's legal standing with respect to both the woman in question and the child. He used the words prior agreement 11 times in his opening. Clara counted. What he did not do, she noticed, was use the word betrothal contract, which told her that someone had advised him that word would not play well in a Texas Panhandle courtroom. Harlan listened with his eyes almost fully closed. When Cruz finished, Harlan looked at Ethan's attorney, a local man named Reeves, who operated out of a single office above the Land Records building and who dressed like a school teacher and spoke like someone who had learned that the simplest sentence was usually the most effective one. Reeves was not dramatic. He was extremely precise. He stood up and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to begin by entering into the record these documents, and I'll ask that Mr. Cruz be given time to review them." He laid them on Harlan's desk one by one. The marriage record, the birth record for Lily, the relinquishment signed by Lily's biological father, the 3 letters from Victor in which he referred to Lily explicitly as Clara's daughter, and this last one Clara had not known about until that morning, a deposition from a housemaid in the Blackthorne household in Connecticut, obtained by mail and notarized, stating that she had witnessed Victor strike Clara on at minimum 4 occasions and had been instructed by Mr. Blackthorne never to speak of it. The room was very quiet when Reeves set that last document down. Clara looked at her hands in her lap. She had not known about the maid. She had not known that woman, quiet, careful, eyes always on the floor, had been watching and remembering, and had been willing from 2,000 miles away to write it down and sign her name to it. She felt something move through her that she couldn't name quickly, something that had to do with the understanding that she had not, even in those years, been as alone as she'd believed herself to be. Cruz objected to the deposition's admissibility. Harlan overruled him with the brevity of a man who has made a decision and sees no reason to elaborate on it. Clara was called to testify after the documents had been entered. She had been dreading this part, not because she didn't know what to say, but because testifying required standing in a room full of people and saying true things out loud, which was different from knowing them privately, different from having them written down on paper. True things said out loud became real in a different way. They couldn't be taken back. Reeves asked her questions in the careful, sequential way he did everything, and she answered them the way Dorothea Pierce had advised her, plainly, without performance, without elaborating beyond what was asked. She said when she had placed the advertisement and why. She said what Ethan's letter had contained and what her own had said. She said when she had arrived in Dust River and what had happened in the weeks that followed. She said that the marriage had been her choice, made freely and with full understanding of what she was doing and why, that the legal protection it offered was a factor, but not the only one, and that she had decided to marry Ethan Callahan because in 4 months of living alongside him, she had found him to be exactly who his letter had said he was. "And is that unusual in your experience?" Reeves asked. Clara looked at him. Someone being who they say they are? Yes. Yes, she said. It's unusual. Then Cruz stood up for his cross-examination, and Clara set her jaw and waited. He started at an angle the way she'd expected, not attacking the marriage directly but circling, asking about her departure from Connecticut, framing the questions to make it sound like flight rather than escape. He asked about her father's financial situation with the tone of a man who already knows the answer. He asked about the circumstances of Lily's birth and who her father was, and whether that man had been informed of the move west. He relinquished all parental rights before Lily was born, Clara said. The document is in front of you. A document your client could have prepared herself, Cruz said to the room. It's notarized and witnessed by 2 Connecticut attorneys, Reeves said from his seat. Mr. Reeves, Harlan said. Withdrawn, Reeves said without particular contrition. Cruz shifted. He asked about the betrothal contract. Clara said she had never signed it and had never agreed to it, that it had been presented to her as a completed document rather than a negotiation, and that she had refused it explicitly and in the presence of witnesses. What witnesses? Cruz asked. The 2 housemaids who were present when Mr. Blackthorne struck me for the 3rd time, Clara said. The room shifted. It was a small movement, a change in the quality of the air, the particular stillness of 24 people absorbing something simultaneously. Cruz had been expecting her to become defensive or evasive. She could see it in the slight adjustment of his posture, and instead she had been direct, and directness was the thing his strategy had no good counter for. That allegation, Cruz started, is supported by a signed deposition already in the record, Reeves said. Mr. Reeves, Harlan said again, but dryly this time. Cruz tried one more angle. He asked whether Clara could say with honesty that her marriage to Ethan Callahan was a genuine union and not a legal arrangement. Clara looked at him. I can say, she said, that I have lived alongside this man for 4 months. I know how he takes his coffee and what he does when he's working through something difficult and which fence line he worries about most before a storm. I know that he built a room for my daughter before he met me and put things on the shelf so it wouldn't look empty. And I know that when I told him about Victor Blackthorne, he said when he comes instead of if, because he'd already decided that whatever came, we'd handle it together. She paused. You can call that an arrangement if you want. I'd call it a marriage. The room was quiet. Cruz looked at his papers. No further questions, he said. Then Victor testified briefly. He was composed and articulate and said everything he needed to say in the measured tones of a man who has practiced, and Clara sat and listened and watched the room watching him and tried to read what she saw on the faces in the gallery. What she saw was not hostility, exactly. It was something more like the careful attention of people who were looking at a man who was performing for them and knew it, and who were deciding, without announcing the decision, that they found the performance less compelling than he'd intended it to be. Harlan asked him one question directly, which was unusual. Judges in her experience didn't interrogate witnesses, but Harlan apparently operated by his own conventions. Mr. Blackthorne, he said, you've traveled from Connecticut to Texas to pursue this matter. That's a significant investment. What is it specifically that you want from this court? Victor looked at him. I want the law honored, he said. I want a prior legal agreement respected. A prior legal agreement with a woman who says she never entered into it, Harlan said, and who has documentation supporting that position. Her documentation is in the record, Harlan said, along with a notarized statement from a member of your household. He looked at Victor for a moment with his half-closed eyes. What is it you want, Mr. Blackthorne? I'd like a plain answer. A long pause. I want her to come back, Victor said, and for just a moment the composure came apart and something underneath it showed, something that Clara recognized from 2 years of living near it, the raw need for control wearing the mask of wounded dignity. The room was very, very quiet. I see, Harlan said. He looked at his papers. We'll recess, and I'll have my ruling before noon. Clara sat outside on the steps of the building during the recess because she needed air, and the room had stopped having enough of it. Ethan sat beside her without being asked. Ruth Henderson appeared with 2 cups of coffee from somewhere and handed them over and went back inside without a word, which was Ruth at her most eloquent. "He said he wanted you to come back," Ethan said. "Not Lily, not the contract. You." "I heard." Harlan heard it too. Clara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The morning had gotten hot now, the panhandle sun arriving to its work with the same total commitment it always brought. Harlan already knew what this was. The testimony just confirmed it. "You were good in there," Ethan said. "I was scared in there." "Same thing some days." She looked at him sideways. There were things she wanted to say that she didn't have adequate language for yet. Things about the 4 months, about what it meant to watch someone be steadily and unprettily reliable over a sustained period of time, about the difference between being cared for and being owned, which she understood now in a way she hadn't when she'd first stepped off the stagecoach. But the words she had available were insufficient, so she didn't try. "Ethan," she said. "Whatever Harlan decides, he'll rule for us." "You don't know that." "I know him," Ethan said. "He asked Victor that question on purpose. He wanted the room to hear the answer." Clara thought about that. "And if he doesn't," she said, "rule for us. I want you to know that I—" She stopped. Started again. "I don't regret any of this. The advertisement, the train, coming here. Whatever happens with the ruling, I don't regret it." Ethan looked at her. His expression was the one she'd cataloged over 4 months. The direct, uncomplicated attention that never seemed to want anything from her in return for being given. "Neither do I," he said. They drank their coffee on the steps in the hot morning sun, and presently Frank Henderson came out and sat on the step below them and talked about a fence problem he was having that had nothing to do with anything, and Clara found to her own surprise that she was grateful for it. Harlan's ruling took 40 minutes. When they filed back in, Clara found her seat and looked straight ahead, and did not look at Victor, who was across the room with Cruz talking into his ear again. She looked at the pine divider that Frank Henderson had built and donated, and she thought about what Ethan had said about what he had out here. Not money but years, not influence but neighbors, not power but history. Harlan came in and sat down and looked at both sides of the room and said, "I'll be brief." He was. The motion to invalidate the marriage was denied. The grounds were direct. A betrothal contract executed without the consent of both parties held no legal force in this jurisdiction, and there was insufficient evidence to support the claim of fraud, given the documented timeline of correspondence and the testimony provided. The marriage between Ethan Callahan and Clara Whitfield Callahan was legally valid and would be treated as such by this court. On the question of the child, there was no biological, legal, or documentable relationship between Victor Blackthorne and the child Lily Whitfield. The claim was dismissed. He looked up from his papers. "I'll add one observation," Harlan said, "which is not part of the formal ruling, but which I'll make for the record. This court has reviewed evidence that Mrs. Callahan left Connecticut under circumstances that included documented physical harm. If any party in this proceeding is considering further legal action in this territory, I would strongly suggest consulting with an attorney about the exposure that documentation creates." He looked at Victor directly. "Do you understand what I'm telling you, Mr. Blackthorne?" A long pause. "Yes," Victor said. His voice was level, his face was not. "Good," Harlan said. "Court is adjourned." The sound in the room afterward was not celebratory exactly. It was more like the sound of people exhaling. Ruth Henderson was beside Clara before she'd fully stood up from her chair, and she didn't say anything, just put one large red hand briefly on Clara's arm, and that was more than enough. May Patterson caught her eye from across the room and nodded. Dorothea Pierce said, passing by, "Plain is better, I told you." Reeves shook Ethan's hand and said he'd file the final paperwork by end of week. Frank Henderson said something about that fence problem again, at greater length this time, which Clara understood now was simply the way Frank expressed goodwill. Victor left. She didn't see him go. She was talking to Ruth when it happened. But at some point she looked across the room and he was simply not there anymore, and Cruz was packing papers into a case with the efficient movements of a man who has already moved on to his next client, and the chair where Victor had been sitting was empty. It should have felt larger somehow. She'd spent months building toward this moment in her mind, had turned it over during the bad nights, had imagined it in various forms, some of which involved saying things she'd never said to his face, and some of which involved him simply leaving and the relief of that being total and complete. The relief was real, but it wasn't total. It wasn't complete. Because she understood, walking out of that building into the bright afternoon, that Victor Blackthorne was not the kind of man who would turn around and go home and accept the accounting of this situation as final. He would absorb it. He would recalibrate. He would find, eventually, another angle. It might take a long time. It might take years. But the habit of reaching for what he believed he was owed was not something a court ruling would erase. She said this to Ethan on the drive home because, not saying it would have been a kind of dishonesty, she'd stopped being able to practice. "You think he'll be back?" Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "I think he doesn't know how to stop," Clara said. "I think losing here just relocates the problem for him, doesn't dissolve it." Ethan was quiet for a moment, the reins easy in his hands, Biscuit moving at her usual unhurried pace. "All right," he said. "All right. We know that. We plan for it." He looked at the road ahead. "We keep the documents organized. We keep Harlan informed. We keep building what we've been building." He paused. "He came out here and he spent money and time. And he lost, Clara. In front of people who'll remember it. That matters. It makes the next move more expensive for him, in every sense." Clara considered that. "You're not frightened," she said. "I didn't say that. You seem steady." "I'm steady because one of us needs to be." He glanced at her sideways. "You've been the steady one for 4 months. Let me carry it for a few days." She looked at him. She thought about the night at the kitchen table, 2 a.m, his folded hands under hers. She thought about what it had taken to build a life that included someone you could say that to. Let me carry it for a few days, and have it be true, and not a performance. "All right," she said. They rode the rest of the way home in the kind of quiet that had become, over 4 months, its own form of conversation. Lily was waiting on the Henderson porch when they arrived to collect her, and she came off the steps with the efficiency of someone who has been waiting for exactly this and launched herself at her mother with a force that nearly knocked Clara sideways. Clara held her, pressed her face into the top of Lily's head, and held her. "Did you win?" Lily said, muffled by Clara's shoulder. "Yes," Clara said. Lily pulled back enough to look at her face, checking, the way she always did, that the answer matched what she saw. It seemed to. "Good," she said, and pulled free and went to Ethan and said, "Ruth said I could take one of the Henderson horses for a ride if you said it was all right." "It's all right," Ethan said. Lily went. Ruth, standing in the doorway, watched her go and said, "She asked me about 10 times whether you were going to win. I told her you would. I hope that wasn't too much pressure." "She would have been fine either way," Clara said. "I know she would have." Ruth's voice was matter-of-fact. "She's got your spine in her. And his patience. That's a good combination." Clara looked at her. "His patience," she said. "Ethan's." Ruth looked at her with the direct attention she brought to everything. "Did you think I didn't notice? 4 months of watching the two of you figure each other out. It's not a performance. I know what a performance looks like." She paused. "He built that room before he met you." "I know," Clara said. "Someone who builds the room first. That's someone who has already decided in advance what kind of man he intends to be." Ruth folded her red hands. "Those people are rare. You should know that." Clara looked out at the paddock where Lily was being helped onto a Henderson horse by Frank, small and serious and sitting straight, and she thought about what she'd said in the courtroom, about coffee preferences and storm preparations, and a shelf that needed something on it. And she thought that she had understood those things as facts before today, but that today, saying them out loud in a room full of people, she had understood them as something else, as the architecture of a life, as the thing she had not known she was building until she turned around and found it already half built. "I know," she said again. "I'm just still getting used to it." Ruth nodded. "Take your time," she said. "You've got it." Basquiat. That evening, back at the ranch, with Lily asleep early from the accumulated weight of 2 days of anxious waiting and the subsequent release of it, Clara and Ethan sat on the porch in the last of the light. The Panhandle sky at dusk was one of the things she'd come to understand as genuinely extraordinary. not in a way that was easy to describe to someone who hadn't seen it, but in the way of something that operated at a scale that made you feel simultaneously small and unusually awake. The colors ran from orange to deep purple across a horizon so wide it seemed to curve, and the first stars were coming in from the east the way they always did, quietly and without announcement. "I need to say something," Clara said. Ethan looked at her. "I came out here with a practical arrangement in mind," she said. "I told you that. I want to be honest about what I think now because I've been imprecise about it, and you deserve precision." He waited. "I don't know yet exactly what this is," she said. "Between us, I'm not going to say something in the big feeling of today that I'd want to qualify tomorrow. That's not fair to either of us." She looked at the sky. "But I know it's real. I know it's more than arrangement, and I know that I want—" She stopped. "I want there to be time to find out the rest of it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's enough," he said. "Is it?" "It's more than enough." He looked out at the fading sky. "Clara, I sent for a woman I'd never met because I thought it was time to stop being alone. I expected a reasonable person and a workable situation. I did not expect—" He paused, choosing words with the same care he chose everything. "This, what it turned out to be." He turned to look at her. "I'm not in a hurry. I've never been a man in a hurry. We've got time." Clara looked at him in the last of the evening light, the man who had fixed a window before he knew who would sleep behind it, who had said when and not if, who had sat with her at 2 a.m. and let the quiet be enough. "The prairie fire season," she said. "When does it start?" He looked at her, adjusting to the shift in subject with the ease of someone used to her mind's movements. "November, usually. Sometimes October if the summer's been dry." "What do we need to do to prepare?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he started talking about fire lines and water storage and the coordination with neighboring properties, practical and detailed. And Clara listened and asked questions, and the evening came down around them fully, and somewhere in the middle of it she stopped waiting for something to go wrong and just sat in the chair she was sitting in, on the porch of the house she lived in, next to the man she had married, and let the night be what it was. The stars came all the way in. The wind moved across the grass in the dark. And somewhere behind her, in the small room with the new window and the pine cones on the shelf, Lily slept without dreaming of running, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, there was nowhere she needed to be except exactly where she was. The fire came on a Wednesday in late October, which was earlier than Ethan had predicted and faster than anyone in the county had seen in years. Clara smelled it before she saw it, that particular quality of smoke that is different from a cooking fire or a burning pile of brush, something larger and more total in it, something that registers in the animal part of the brain before the thinking part is caught up. She was at the water pump when it reached her, and she stood with the bucket in her hand and turned south and saw the sky along the horizon had gone the wrong color. She left the bucket at the pump and walked to the barn. "Ethan!" He was already outside, already looking south. The smoke line was maybe 3 miles out and moving, and the wind was doing what panhandle wind does in October. Shifting, gusting, entirely unreliable. He'd told her about this in the summer, sitting on the porch, answering her questions about fire season with the patient detail of a man who has fought this particular enemy before and respects it. She had listened then. She was applying it now. "How fast?" she said. "Depends on the wind." He was already moving. "It shifts north, we're in the path. Stays south, we're clearing fire lines for the Holt property." He didn't tell her to go inside, she noticed that. "What do you need me to do?" she said. "Get Lily to the Hendersons. Take the horse, not the wagon, it's faster." "And then?" He looked at her. He had a shovel in his hand and his hat was already pulled low. "And then come back," he said. "If you want to, I won't ask you to." Clara went and saddled the horse. She'd been riding for 3 months now. Not well, not with the ease of someone who'd grown up on horseback, but well enough, which was the standard the frontier seemed to apply to everything. Well enough to do the thing that needed doing. She got Lily up from the kitchen table where she'd been working on arithmetic, helped her onto the horse in front of her, and rode hard for the Henderson place. Lily didn't ask questions. She held the saddle horn with both hands and leaned back into her mother and looked at the smoke on the horizon with the calm assessment of a child who has learned to read her mother's urgency accurately and respond to it without adding to it. Ruth was already outside when they came up the road, shading her eyes southward. She looked at Clara on the horse with Lily in front of her and opened the gate without a word. "How bad?" she said. "Don't know yet." Clara passed Lily down to her, and Ruth took the child with the easy competence of a large woman who had held many children over many years. "Frank's already gone?" 40 minutes ago. He took the Holt boy with him." Ruth looked at her. "You're going back?" "Yes." Ruth looked at her for another moment, not trying to stop her. That was not Ruth's way, and they both knew it. Just looking, in the manner of someone registering a thing she wants to remember. "Stay low if the smoke thickens," she said. "Keep a wet cloth if you have one. Don't get ahead of the fire line." "I know," Clara said. "Lily," Ruth said, not looking away from Clara. "Yes, ma'am," Lily said. "Your mother's going to help. That's what people do out here." Lily looked at her mother on the horse. Her expression was the one she'd been wearing for months now. Not the old fear, but something more settled than that, something that had to do with understanding that the world was difficult and that the people she loved moved through it anyway. "I know," Lily said. Clara turned the horse and rode back toward the smoke. The fire line work was the hardest physical labor she had done in her life, and she had been doing hard physical labor for 6 months. There were perhaps 20 people spread across the area south of the Callahan and Holt properties when she arrived. Men and women from half a dozen ranching families, working in the organized chaos of people who have done this before and know what the next hour requires. Frank Henderson was directing a section of it, shouting across the wind, his face already dark with ash. Ethan was further south with a group of 4 men she recognized, digging and clearing with the focused speed of people working against a clock they could see. May Patterson was there. Dorothea Pierce was there. A woman Clara didn't know, who turned out to be the wife of the man who ran the livery stable, was there, passing water buckets with an efficiency that suggested this was not her first fire season. No one told Clara what to do. She looked at what was being done and found the gap and filled it. She worked on the fire line for 4 hours. There was nothing beautiful about it, and she was not going to remember it that way. Her hands blistered, and 2 of the blisters broke, and she kept working. She fell twice on the uneven ground, both times getting up with the mechanical economy of someone who has no attention left over for humiliation. At one point the wind shifted and the smoke rolled over the line they were working, and she lost sight of everything beyond 3 feet and spent 2 minutes moving on instinct and the sound of voices before it cleared. She was not heroic, she was functional, which is what was needed. At some point she found herself working beside May Patterson, the 2 of them clearing brush from a section of ground that the men with shovels would follow, and May said, without stopping, "You're bleeding on your glove." "I know," Clara said. "There's more cloth in the wagon if you need it." "After this section," Clara said. May nodded and kept working. That was it. No more was needed. The fire turned south again in the late afternoon when the wind made one of its arbitrary decisions, and by evening it was clear that the Callahan property and the Holt property to the east had held. The Henderson land hadn't been threatened. 2 smaller properties further west had lost fence lines, and one lost a section of barn. But no animals died and no people were hurt beyond the ordinary injuries of hard work. People stood around in the fading light with the particular exhaustion of collective effort completed, the kind that is different from regular tiredness because it has shared purpose baked into it. There was water passing around, and someone had brought food, practical food, bread and dried meat, the kind of thing you eat standing up. And Clara sat on the ground with her back against a fence post and ate, and did not say anything for quite a long time. Ethan found her there. He sat down beside her in the dust and took some of the bread and ate it, and they looked at the smoke dissipating over the southern plain in the last of the daylight. "The south fence line will need work," he said. "I know." "The Henderson section held." "I know that too." He looked at her hands, the broken blisters, the cloth May had helped her wrap around the worst one. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked, in the way of someone registering damage with an eye toward repair, and then looked away. "Dorothea Pierce told me you worked the line without stopping," he said. "So did everyone else. Everyone else grew up doing this." Claire looked at the smoke. "I grew up doing other things," she said. Doesn't mean I can't learn. She heard something shift in his breathing beside her, some small exhalation that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. No, he said. It doesn't mean that. They sat in the dust until the light went completely, and then got up and found the wagon and went to collect Lily from the Hendersons. And Lily climbed into the back and fell asleep before they'd gone a mile. And Clara drove home beside Ethan under a sky still faintly orange to the south, and thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 7 months ago with blistered hands of a different kind, the indoor kind, the kind that came from gripping something too hard out of fear, and thought that she would not go back to being that woman for anything in the world. November passed. December came with cold that surprised her despite everything Ethan had said to prepare her for it, a cold that had teeth and meant it. The house was warmer than it had any right to be considering its construction, which turned out to be because Ethan had spent 3 days in September rechinking the walls and adding wood to the interior of the north-facing rooms, which she hadn't noticed because he'd done it while she was managing the accounts and taking Lily to the Hendersons for a writing lesson. She found out about it from Frank, who mentioned it in passing. She went home and looked at the north wall of the kitchen with new eyes, and then went and found Ethan in the barn. You re-insulated the walls in September, she said. He looked up from what he was doing. Before the cold came, he said, like this was explanation enough. You didn't say anything about it. Didn't seem like it needed saying. Clara stood in the barn doorway and looked at him, this man she had married in a dry goods store with a sniffling judge and a torn hem on Lily's sleeve, and she thought about what Ruth Henderson had said. Someone who builds the room first has already decided what kind of man he intends to be. And she thought that this was simply who he was, all the way through, in every small and unremarked act, that there was no gap between the performance and the reality because there was no performance. She had spent 2 years living with a man who was made entirely of performance. She understood the difference now in her bones. Thank you, she said. It's cold in winter, he said. Didn't want you and Lily to be cold. I know why you did it, she said. I'm thanking you anyway. He looked at her with the direct, slightly puzzled attention he used when he wasn't sure what was being communicated. Then something settled in his face. You're welcome, he said. She went back to the house and stood in the warm kitchen for a moment and pressed her palms flat against the rechinked wall and felt the difference it made against the cold outside, and thought that this, too, was what a marriage could be. Not grand gestures and performed devotion, but a wall that kept the cold out, noticed or not. The letter came in January. It was from Connecticut. She knew the handwriting on the envelope, her cousin Sarah's careful script, and she sat with it for a long time before she opened it. Sarah wrote to say that Victor Blackthorne had, in December, become engaged to a woman named Harriet Weld, the daughter of a Boston shipping family with considerably more money than Clara's family had ever possessed. Sarah wrote that the engagement had been announced at a dinner party and that Victor had been charming and composed and entirely as though nothing had happened in the preceding year, which was either impressive or terrifying, depending on how you looked at it. She wrote that their mother was well. She wrote that the house had been sold, as Clara probably knew, and that their father's debts had been resolved. She wrote that she thought about Clara and wondered sometimes whether she was all right. At the bottom, in different ink, as though she'd added it after, I hope you found something good out there. You deserved to. Clara read the letter twice. Then she folded it and sat with it in her lap for a while. Victor was gone. Not metaphorically gone, not simply absent, actively turned in another direction, aimed at a different target, his relentless need for acquisition redirected towards someone who did not know yet what she was agreeing to. Clara felt something about this that she couldn't reduce to one thing. Relief? Yes. And also something sadder. For the woman named Harriet Weld, who was probably sitting somewhere in Boston right now believing herself fortunate. But that was not her situation to solve. She had learned, painfully and over time, that you could not save everyone. You could only save yourself. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very determined, the people who depended on you. She wrote back to Sarah that evening. She wrote that she was well, that Lily was well, that the ranch was doing better than expected, that the winter was very cold and the land was very flat, and the sky was the largest thing she'd ever seen. She wrote that she had found something good. She did not elaborate because she didn't need to. She sealed the letter and set it on the table to go to town with Ethan in the morning, and she went to check on Lily, who was reading in bed with the lamp going in her small room with the new window and the pine cones on the shelf. And she stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her daughter reading, and thought that the world was very large, and she had navigated a very difficult piece of it and come out somewhere she had not dared to imagine when she'd first written that careful, honest advertisement and waited for someone to respond. "Mama," Lily said without looking up. "You're staring." "I know," Clara said. "You can go back to reading. I'm going to be too tired if I read much longer." "Then put the lamp out." "In a minute." Clara leaned against the doorframe and watched her read for another minute, because she could, because there was nowhere she needed to be except right here, and she was still learning, slowly, to let that be true, without waiting for it to end. Spring came gradually and then all at once, the way it does in flat country where you can see the change coming from a long way off. The grass came back in the south field, and Ethan started talking about expanding the cattle operation, which led to a series of conversations at the kitchen table that lasted across several evenings, and which Clara participated in as a full party to the decision, not as a bystander being informed. She caught herself noticing that, being noticed as a full party. She had been doing this, cataloging the ways the ordinary texture of her life had changed since the letter from Sarah had arrived, as though the news of Victor's definitive departure had given her permission to take stock. The accounts were hers now, in all but name. Ethan handed them to her in the second month and hadn't taken them back. She understood the ranch's finances better than he did, which he acknowledged without embarrassment in the practical way he acknowledged everything. She had started to have opinions about the cattle operation that went beyond the financial. Opinions about timing and breed and which properties their neighbors might be willing to sell access to. And Ethan listened to those opinions with the same careful attention he gave things he'd thought of himself. The fence dispute with Garrett Poole had resolved so thoroughly that Poole now tipped his hat to Clara when he saw her in town, which both of them understood to be a significant diplomatic development. Dorothea Pierce had invited her to be part of a loose organization of female property owners in the county who met quarterly and shared information about land management, water rights, and the various ways the law did and did not serve their interests. Clara had gone once, in February, and come home with 3 pages of notes and the address of an attorney in Amarillo who specialized in water rights disputes and who Dorothea said was the only honest one she'd found. Ruth Henderson had said, when she told her about the meeting, "Took you long enough." "I've been busy," Clara said. "You've been settling in," Ruth said. "That's different. Now you're ready to start." She thought about that often. But the cottonwood tree at the south edge of the property was the oldest living thing on the land, and in April it put out new leaves the way it did every year, thousands of small green things appearing along its heavy branches over the course of 2 weeks. Lily had claimed it in September, spent hours in its lower branches reading and looking at things, and occasionally narrating what she saw to anyone within earshot. She'd asked Ethan how old it was, and he'd said he didn't know, but that it had been there when he arrived and had looked exactly the same, which seemed to satisfy her. On a Sunday morning in April, Clara walked out to it and sat at its base and thought. She didn't do this often, sit still without a task, because the habit of constant motion was one she'd built over 2 years of needing to be always useful, always occupied, always too busy to sit in the quiet where the fear lived. But the fear had changed shape. It was still there, because she was honest enough with herself to know that it would always be there in some form. The knowledge that the world was not permanently safe, that it required maintenance, that you could not simply arrive somewhere and be done. But it was a different size than it had been. It took up less of the available space. Ethan found her there an hour later. He didn't ask what she was doing. He sat down beside her with the unhurried ease of a man who has spent years understanding that some things don't need to be spoken to be shared, and they sat under the cottonwood with the spring light coming through the new leaves above them and the south field green in front of them, and for a while neither of them said anything. "I've been thinking about something," Clara said. "The vows." She looked at the leaves moving above them. In Harlan's office. In October. What about them? She was quiet for a moment, choosing words. I said them, she said, and I meant what I could mean at the time, but I was calculating. I knew I was doing it partly for protection, for Lily, for the legal standing, and I knew that, and I was honest about it. She paused. I'm not the same woman who stood in that room, and I want to say what I would say now, not in a courtroom, not in front of a judge, just... She gestured at the field, the tree, the ordinary Sunday morning. Here. Ethan looked at her. She turned to face him. His face in the spring light was the face she knew now. The creases from weather and years of squinting at distances, the particular quality of attention in his eyes that had never once made her feel observed or evaluated, only seen. I choose you, she said, not because of what you can provide or because you said the right things at the right moment, because of who you are when no one's asking you to be anything, the way you fixed the window before you knew who would sleep behind it, the way you said when and not if, the way you sat with me at 2 a.m. and understood that what I needed was not answers but company. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. I'm not good at this. I'm not going to say it the way people say it in novels. I don't want the novel version, he said. I know. She looked at him. I love you. I should have said it sooner and I didn't because I was still learning whether it was safe to, and I'm sorry for that, except that I'm not entirely sorry because it needed to be true before I said it, and now it is. Ethan was quiet for a moment. The cottonwood moved above them. I knew, he said. I know you knew. I was waiting, he said. I know that too. He reached over and took her hand, not like a gesture in a story, just the way people hold hands who have been living beside each other long enough that the physical fact of the other person is familiar and necessary. His hand was rough from the work, and hers was too now, and neither of them said anything about it. I love you, he said, in case that also needed saying. It did, she said. A little. They sat under the cottonwood for a long time. The field moved in the spring wind. A hawk worked the thermal above the south pasture with the patient efficiency of a creature that understands its environment completely. Somewhere behind them, from the direction of the barn, came the sound of Lily explaining something at length to Biscuit, who was the most patient audience she had ever found. I'm Nitem. What came after was not perfect. That is the honest account of it, and Clara had learned to value honesty over prettiness in all things. So the honest account is what she would give. The summer of that year was difficult, a drought that thinned the grazing and put financial pressure on the expanded cattle operation that took 3 months and some hard decisions to work through. She and Ethan disagreed twice about those decisions, actual disagreements with raised voices, and the specific frustration of 2 people who each think they're right and are each partially right and have to find the third way through without anyone surrendering the part they're right about. They found it both times. It was not elegant. Lily turned 9 that summer and developed an opinion about everything and a willingness to express it that Clara recognized as her own temperament in miniature and found exhausting in the way you find exhausting things that are most accurate about yourself. She was brilliant and difficult and funny and sometimes infuriating, and she trusted Ethan with the complete certainty of someone who had tested a thing rigorously and found it solid. Ruth Henderson's husband, Frank, had a health scare in August. His heart, the doctor said, and he'd need to rest and reduce the physical demands of his work. They spent 2 weeks helping the Hendersons reorganize the ranch labor while Frank recovered, and Ruth, who was not a woman who accepted help without resistance, accepted it from them in the quiet way of someone who understands that the debts between neighbors run in both directions and always have. Victor Blackthorne did not reappear. The letter about his engagement to Harriet Weld was the last information Clara received from that direction, and she chose not to seek more. She did not forget him. It would have been dishonest to pretend she had, and the memory of what he'd done was information she intended to keep, because information has value. But she stopped carrying him as a weight. She put him somewhere in the back of her mind where the things she'd survived lived, and she let him be what he actually was, a chapter that was finished. The paperwork was always organized. That was the one thing that never changed, the one habit from that first year that she maintained with the discipline of someone who knows exactly why they do it. Every document, every record, every letter with legal significance filed and cross-referenced and accessible. Ethan had said once, watching her do it, that she was the most methodical person he'd ever lived with. "It kept us in this house," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not complaining." She filed the document and moved on. There's a thing that happens to people who have survived something. Not immediately, not in the first year or even the second, but later, when enough time has passed that the survival itself has become ordinary. They stop thinking of themselves as people who survived and start thinking of themselves as people who live. It is a subtle shift, and it happens without announcement, and you often don't notice it until you're on the other side of it and looking back. Clara noticed it on a morning in the second autumn, standing at the kitchen window with coffee in her hand, watching Ethan work on the south fence line that had needed repairing since the fire, watching Lily ride in the paddock on a horse of her own now, a young bay mare named Scout that she'd been given in exchange for 3 months of helping Dorothea Pierce with her horse operations accounts. She was not thinking about Victor. She was not thinking about Connecticut or the train or the stagecoach or the moment she'd stepped into the Dust of Dust River with everything she owned in a carpet bag. She was thinking about whether the south pasture could support an additional section of fence this season, and about the water rights meeting in November, and about Lily's arithmetic, which was excellent, but whose handwriting needed work. She was thinking about her life. Not the escape from a life. Her life. It took her a moment to register the shift, and when she did, she stood at the window a little longer than she'd intended, not wanting to disturb it. Some things you have to let arrive in their own time. You can't make them happen, and you can't hurry them, and the harder you try to hold them still when they get there, the faster they slip. The only way to have them is to build the conditions in which they might be possible, and then go on about your work and let them find you. This was the thing she had learned that she had not known when she'd written that honest advertisement and waited for someone to respond. She had thought she was looking for a safe place to put herself and her daughter until she figured out the next thing. She had not understood that the making of the place and the figuring out of herself were the same project, that you do not find a home and then become yourself inside it, but that you become yourself and the home comes into being as a result, through work and difficulty, and the accumulated unremarkable days of showing up and doing what the day requires. She had not known that. She knew it now. Lily came in from the paddock with hay in her hair and her boots muddy and the bright, full-faced look of a child who has been completely physical and completely happy. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it standing at the counter and then said, "Scout is getting better at the canter. Ethan says by spring she'll be ready for the longer trails." "Ethan knows horses," Clara said. "He knows a lot of things," Lily said, in the tone of someone stating a self-evident truth. She set her glass down. "Mama?" "Are we staying here? Always, I mean. Is this where we live now?" Clara looked at her daughter. The hay in her hair, the muddy boots, the horse smell on her jacket, the easy stance of a body that knows it belongs where it is. "Yes," she said. "This is where we live." Lily nodded like this confirmed something she'd already decided. "Good," she said. Scout would miss the paddock. She went down the hall to clean up for lunch, and Clara turned back to the window, and Ethan was coming in from the south fence line, and the light was doing the thing it did in October in the Panhandle, long and golden, and somehow very specific about everything it touched. She thought about the woman on the stagecoach, the carpet bag, the hidden bruise, the child holding her dress, the fear that had been so constant it had stopped feeling like fear and had just become the texture of being alive. She did not stop feeling for that woman. She did not look back with the superior distance of someone who has come through and imagines they are safe from all future difficulty. She looked back with the honest recognition of someone who understands that the woman on the stagecoach did the only possible right thing, which was to make a decision and move toward it and not stop moving until there was ground under her feet that she'd helped to build. That woman was not gone. She was here, at this window, with coffee going cold in her hand and hay to order before winter, and a daughter who smelled like a horse, and a husband coming in from the fence line. She was exactly here. The door opened and Ethan came in and hung his hat and said, "The south section's going to need another day." "I know," Clara said. I saw the gap from here." He washed his hands and came to stand beside her at the window, looking at the paddock where Scout was grazing in the October light. "Good horse," he said. "Lily thinks so." "Lily's right." He looked out at the field. "Cold tonight." "I know. I've already put more wood in." He looked at her sideways. "When did you do that?" "This morning while you were on the fence line." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't say anything." "What? Didn't seem like it needed saying," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something moved between them that was made entirely of the months and the work and the mornings and the difficulty and the ordinary, unremarkable fact of having chosen each other and gone on choosing and kept going. "No," he said, "I suppose it doesn't." He poured his coffee and sat down, and she sat across from him, and outside the panhandle light moved across the grass, and the day continued in all its imperfect, sufficient, irreplaceable reality, and there was nowhere else to be.